You're in a London drawing room in 1822, and you are being introduced to a prince. He wears green and gold, a sash of unearned medals, an order called the Green Cross at his throat. Bankers bow to him. The Lord Mayor has received him at the Guildhall. He rules a country called Poyais, a fertile nation on the coast of Central America with a capital city, a cathedral, an opera house, and gold promised in its mines. Within a year, ordinary people will hand this man more than $140 million in today's money. They will sell their homes to go and live in his country. His weapon was not a gun. It was the country itself, a nation that did not exist, that had never existed, that he had invented down to its banknotes. 250 of them would sail for it. Fewer than 50 would come home. How do you make a whole nation believe in a country that was never there? The country was called Poyais, and the prince's name was Gregor MacGregor. To understand how he persuaded bankers, clerks, and ordinary tradesmen to fund a nation he had drawn out of thin air, you have to go back, past the medals, past the title, to a young officer in Scotland who had already worked out that the surest way to be treated like a great man was simply to look like one. MacGregor was born in 1786 in Stirlingshire into a Scottish family with deep military ties. He joined the British Army as a teenager and served through the Peninsular War in the 57th Regiment of Foot, fighting Napoleon's armies across Spain and Portugal. Even in the mud-soaked chaos of those campaigns, the thing that defined him was not courage. It was appearance. He was a young man of extreme self-confidence and a pedant about uniform regulations, fixated on the precise tailoring of every red coat and white crossbelt under his command, enforcing harsh discipline over the cut of a collar amid the smoke of musket fire. He resigned his commission amid disputes with his superiors and came home with little to show for it but his bearing. In Edinburgh, a society obsessed with ancestry and prestige, he set about reinventing himself. He rode through the city in an extravagant horse-drawn coach, flashing the badge of a Portuguese knightly order he had never earned, his whole lifestyle propped up by his first wife's dowry. Before long, he went looking for a larger stage. He found it in South America. In 1811, MacGregor sailed to Venezuela and offered his sword to the revolutions tearing the Spanish Empire apart. He was commissioned by men like Francisco de Miranda and Simón Bolívar, and he married Josefa, a cousin of Bolívar himself, a connection he would lean on for the rest of his life to prove he was somebody. He earned a genuine reputation there, riding at the front in a plumed shako, leading desperate hundreds of miles-long retreats through hostile, mosquito-choked country, and was decorated with the Order of Libertadores. But there were embarrassments too. At Portobello, he reportedly escaped advancing Spanish forces by leaping from a window. Bolívar's circle began to keep its distance, and MacGregor needed a new role. He was about to discover that he didn't need a real country to play a prince in one. He could build his own. He built the first one in 1817, off the coast of the United States. That summer, MacGregor and a band of mercenaries seized Amelia Island, a humid, lawless haven near Spanish Florida, and declared the birth of the Republic of the Floridas. Over the wooden palisades of Fort San Carlos, he raised a flag bearing a green cross. He set up a printing press and ran off paper money, Amelia dollars, to pay his ragged men. He drafted constitutional documents for a republic that was barely a fort. He held it for 68 days. When the money ran dry and Spanish forces closed in, MacGregor abandoned his men and slipped away by ship in the night. It was a rehearsal. He had learned that the costume of a real government, a flag, a currency, a constitution, could stand in for the thing itself. He didn't need to forge a single document. He could forge a whole country. In April 1820, he found the raw material for the real masterpiece. On the Mosquito Coast of Honduras, MacGregor met George Frederick Augustus I, the local Mosquito King, and plied him with rum and cheap jewelry. In return, the king granted him 8 million acres of unbroken jungle. The grant was for settlement and development, not for sovereignty. the king had given him land to farm. MacGregor sailed back to Europe and turned that conditional deed into a crown. By 1821, he was in London, styling himself the Cazique, the Prince of Poyais. He dressed the part completely in a dazzling green and gold uniform with heavy epaulets and a tight collar, hung with unearned honors, the green cross on a wide ribbon, and a Maltese cross at his chest. With his dark hair, brown eyes, and a perpetual flush in his cheeks, he looked every inch the exotic young royal that London wanted to believe in. He went further still, inventing ranks, offices, and military commissions, an entire civil service for a wilderness. He opened a Poyaisian legation. He was received at the Guildhall by the Lord Mayor in the gas-lit financial heart of the empire, where bankers in tailored coats took him for exactly what he claimed to be. And to certify the dream in print, he produced a book, a 355-page guide called Sketch of the Mosquito Shore, credited to one Thomas Strangeways, described as aide-de-camp to the Cazique. Strangeways did not exist. MacGregor had written it himself, stitched together from plagiarized geography and outright invention, with a thriving capital named St. Joseph, fertile fields, and gold promised in its mines. Of the soil he wrote that in the territory of Poyais, there are 3 crops of Indian corn in the year, and the produce will generally exceed 100 bushels an acre. Then he did the thing no swindler had quite managed before. He floated an entire nation on the stock market. In October 1822, a 200,000-pound government bond for Poyais, a general mortgage loan for the new state, went on sale on the London Stock Exchange, signed by his chargé d'affaires, Major William Richardson. The bond itself looked the part, an ornate document in black and blue, the kind of sovereign paper a real young nation would issue, lending the whole enterprise the weight of a real treasury. Richardson, who ran the Poyaisian legation and commanded MacGregor's invented Order of the Green Cross, gave the scheme the look of a genuine diplomatic mission. He had its currency printed in Scotland, counterfeit banknotes for a counterfeit country. And people believed. They believed completely. The bond went out at a discount, and the British public poured in something like 150,000 pounds of real money against the credit of a place that was not real. But MacGregor did not only sell paper to speculators, he sold a country to families. He offered fictitious posts in his imaginary government, a royal shoemaker, a jeweler, a manager for its theater, which existed only on paper. And ordinary tradesmen bought the warrants, cashing out their savings and trading hard British sterling for worthless Poyais dollars. He aimed the con with care. He targeted his fellow Scots, dangling a colonial triumph that would heal an old national wound, the memory of Darien, Scotland's ruinous, failed colony of the 1690s. For many Scots, Poyais was not merely an investment. It was a chance at the empire their nation had been denied, a wound still tender more than a century later, and MacGregor knew precisely where to press. In his manifesto, he declared that in Poyais, the industrious and honest, none others shall be admitted among us. To his imagined subjects, he wrote with the tenderness of a benevolent ruler, promising that through the kindness of Providence, he would return to them as your faithful Cazique and father. It read like a privilege. It worked like bait. MacGregor understood something most swindlers miss. People do not invest in paper. They invest in prestige. His ornate uniforms, his self-appointed title, and above all, that reception at the Guildhall, short-circuited the ordinary skepticism of bankers and tradesmen alike. If the Lord Mayor of London had shaken his hand, who were they to doubt him? Here is what made the fraud almost impossible to see. Poyais was not competing against the truth. It was competing against other new countries that nobody in London could check either. In the 1820s, British investors were starved for yield. Government bonds at home paid 3%. The new Latin American republics were offering 6%. South America really was breaking free of Spain, and real nations, Colombia, Chile, really were issuing real bonds. News across the Atlantic took months to arrive, so an ordinary investor had no way to verify any of it. To a banker in London, Poyais looked exactly like the others. This is the quiet engine underneath the Poyais swindle, and underneath a great many frauds since. A lie is hardest to catch not when it is wild, but when it sits calmly beside the truth. MacGregor had hidden his lie inside a real one, and the real one did the rest. By late 1822, the ships were ready, and the ships had sailed before most of Britain understood what it had bought. The first vessel, the Honduras packet, left London in September 1822 with about 70 settlers. The second, the Kennersley Castle, sailed from Leith in January 1823, carrying nearly 180 more, a 100-foot ship packed below decks with hopeful Scots, their belongings, and crates of farm tools for the New World. Whole families had sold up and given up trades they would never recover, certain they were sailing toward a better life. Among them was James Hastie, a sawyer traveling with his wife and 3 children toward the land and the new life he had been promised. They expected to step off the ship at St. Joseph into the bustling capital, the deep water port, the cathedral. In March 1823, they reached the mouth of the Black River and found none of it. There was no city. No port, no road, no shelter, nothing but silent, unbroken jungle where the capital was meant to stand, their belongings sinking into the mud of the shore. They built bamboo huts and pitched tents along the beach, and then the tropical rains came. The man MacGregor had appointed to lead them, Colonel Hector Hall, proved indifferent to their fate. He left the sick to travel up the coast, refused to pay the promised wages, and arranged no rescue, and every failure of his cost more lives among people who had trusted the man who appointed him. The settlers were alone, on a beach, in a country that was not there. Then, they began to die. Malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery moved through the camp as the rains fell. Hastie later wrote that, "It seemed to be the will of Providence that every circumstance should combine for our destruction." The weakest could no longer move from where they lay. One settler had bought the warrant to serve as royal shoemaker to the Princess of Poyais, leaving his family behind in Edinburgh on a promise to send for them once he was established. When he understood that there was no princess, no court, no city, that he had brought his family to ruin for a fiction, he walked into the jungle and shot himself. These were not speculators gambling money they could spare. They were a shoemaker, a sawyer, working people who had sold everything they owned for a deed to a house in a city that was never built. If you have ever saved for years toward a single thing, the home you meant to grow old in, you understand exactly what these families carried up the gangway and handed across the counter. What MacGregor took from them was not only their savings, it was their trust. And some of them paid for that trust with their children. Into this came a second man carrying the truth. The Mosquito King, George Frederick Augustus, learned that hundreds of Europeans had camped on his land claiming to be subjects of a prince. Educated in Jamaica, the king came to them and told them the grant was void. MacGregor had never held sovereignty, only a conditional right to land he had failed to develop, and he would not honor a title he had never given. The survivors recorded his ultimatum, that they could remain only in subjection to him and must renounce MacGregor completely, failing which, in their own words, he would bring down a strong force and massacre every man of us. In May 1823, a schooner out of British Belize, the Mexican Eagle, began carrying the dying north to the colonial hospitals, where gaunt, fever-ravaged survivors filled the wards and the full weight of the betrayal finally settled over them. James Hastie survived. 2 of his children did not. they died after the evacuation in Belize. Of roughly 250 who had sailed, about 180 would never leave that coast alive. The rescue was what finally broke the story open. Colonial authorities in Belize raised the alarm. The Royal Navy intercepted 5 more Poyais-bound ships before they could reach the same beach, and the scandal spread across the London press. When the survivors testified, they laid the paradise they had been sold against the swamp they had found. The soil, MacGregor had promised, was so impossibly rich that, in Hasty's words, if you buried a turtle's egg in the sand, in 10 minutes it would be as well boiled as if it had been put into a kettle. One newspaper summed up the whole affair as a medley of knavery and credulity, an extraordinary mixture of impudent imposture and confiding folly. Fewer than 50 settlers ever made it home to Britain. And as the survivors limped back, the man who had sent them was already gone. MacGregor fled to France, and then he did it again, in another country. By 1825, he was in Paris, running essentially the same scheme behind a new front, a colonization company called Nouvelle Industrie, attempting to raise some £300,000 in fresh capital against Poyais land. He had buried 180 people in a fiction, watched it collapse in the British press, and simply carried the same fiction across the channel to start again. This time, the authorities moved first. In December 1825, he was arrested for fraud and held in the cold stone cells of La Force prison. When his trial came the following year, MacGregor turned the courtroom into theater. His own lawyer, Joseph Marilou, stepped down and reappeared as a witness for the prosecution. A new advocate, Burville, rose and read a 5,000-word statement of MacGregor's innocence into the record, while the prince sat in a sharp suit, feigning aristocratic indignation. The defense pinned the entire conspiracy on an associate named Lehuby, who had conveniently fled to the Netherlands and could not speak for himself. Without him and without his papers, the court could not prove a criminal conspiracy against the well-spoken prince in the dock. MacGregor was acquitted of every charge. 2 minor associates jailed alongside him were freed as well. Lehuby, tried in his absence, was the only man convicted in the whole affair, sentenced to 13 months. It was a kind of dark legal marvel, proof of how easily the courts of the age could be disarmed by a confident man with a title. The architect of a swindle that had killed 180 people walked out of a Paris court a free man, his title intact, the blame transferred to someone who wasn't in the room. But he was not finished, and he was never meaningfully punished. MacGregor returned to London in 1827 and spent the better part of a decade trying to revive smaller versions of Poyais, issuing a fresh constitution as late as 1836, long after the name had become a byword for ruin. By 1838, he was effectively destitute, out of money and out of countries. So he staged one last reinvention, the most audacious of them all. He moved to Venezuela and asked its government to recognize him as a hero of its War of Independence. And it did. Remembering his early victories and his marriage into Bolivar's family, the Republic welcomed him back without a second thought. It granted him citizenship, reinstated him as a general, and paid him a state pension for the rest of his days, an honored veteran in one country for the very confidence that had ruined families in another. In the sun-drenched plazas of Caracas, an aging, silver-haired MacGregor attended state functions in full military regalia, his fraudulent past entirely unknown to the people around him. When he died there in December 1845, the man who had sent 180 settlers to their graves was buried with full military honors beneath the arches of the city's cathedral, mourned as a soldier and a statesman. Perhaps the strangest part is what his own victims did with the truth. Having lost their savings and their families, a number of survivors refused to blame MacGregor at all. It was easier to believe that honest agents had bungled a real colony than to admit they had been ruined by something that had never existed. The lie had taken everything from them, and still they protected it. Today, Poyais sits in the textbooks beside the South Sea bubble as one of the founding case studies of financial fraud, remembered as one of the most brazen confidence tricks ever attempted. The rare swindle measured not only in money but in graves, and a genuine Bank of Poyais dollar, currency for a country that was never real, rests in the Smithsonian's National Collection in Washington, a quiet American footnote to a Scottish tragedy. And a strange bookend to the counterfeit dollars he had once run off a printing press on Amelia Island, off the Florida coast where the whole performance began. You may have heard that MacGregor stole more than £1 billion. He did not. That number is a myth, built by stretching his imaginary land values against the size of the modern economy. The real money was far smaller, barely £1 million at the time. But the scale of the theft was never the point. His victims did not lose their lives over a sum. They lost them over a place. A green and gold country, with a cathedral, an opera house, and 3 crops of corn a year that no one ever built. Because it had only ever existed in the mind of the man they trusted to carry them there. Tell me in the comments, was MacGregor a swindler who knew Poyais was a lie? Or a man who believed it himself? If this was the kind of story you can't look away from, there's another one waiting. Keep watching.